So as we look at the Obama presidency, he did not merely occupy the presidency. He kind of curated it. He understood that in an era of spectacle, the presidency had become less a governing office and more than a national kind of myth-taking institution. His image, the sharp suits, the poetic cadence, it became an instrument of power in itself. Photographs of Obama were not captured, they were composed. His speeches did not simply communicate policy, they enveloped listeners in a moral universe. Welcome to Chasing Power. I'm your host, Charles Denyer, and tonight we walk through the long shadow of Barack Obama, a leader who rose as a symbol of hope, governed in the crucible of crisis, and left behind in America still wrestling with the brilliance and the burdens of his legacy.
President Obama has won a second term as President of the United States.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. I strongly believe that our national security interest now depends upon preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
I stand before you again tonight, after almost 2 terms as your president, to tell you I am more optimistic about the future of America than ever before.
Welcome to Chasing Power, the path to Pennsylvania Avenue, a Charles Denyer Productions podcast.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
The audacity of hope. America, you vindicated that hope.
And we will make America great again.
By 2012, Barack Obama was a president marked by scars, political, emotional, symbolic. Long gone was the soaring optimism of 2008. In its place stood a man who had tasted the bitterness of expectations, the limits of compromise, and the sting of disillusionment. And now he was also a president up for re-election. His opponent, Mitt Romney.
The president has a view very similar to the view he had when he ran 4 years ago, that a bigger government, spending more, taxing more.
He seemed to be engineered in a lab for presidential competence. Articulate, accomplished, disciplined, and polished to such a sheen he almost reflected light. Romney embodied the very CEO image. The problem solver, the fixer, the executive America should have wanted after years of crisis. However, optics are rarely destiny. To millions of Americans battered by the recession, Mitt Romney did not resemble the corporate elite. He embodied it. He was the man with homes scattered across America's most exclusive zip codes, a portfolio of properties that felt worlds away from the shuttered factories and underwater mortgages. His fortune came from stepping into struggling companies, stripping them to their studs, and carving out the profitable pieces, then tossing the rest aside with corporate coldness. To voters still reeling from layoffs and foreclosures, Mitt Romney was not a symbol of success. He was a reminder of the boardroom culture that had treated workers as expendable line items on a balance sheet. And Obama's team understood this with brutal clarity, and they went after him by dismantling his CEO mythology, showing voters that the man promising efficiency and order had built his fortune on layoffs, leveraged debt, and the quiet hollowing out of American companies. Then came the 47% moment.
There are 47% of the people who will vote for the president no matter what. All right, there are 47% who are with him, who are dependent upon government, who believe that they are victims, who believe that government has a responsibility to care for them.
Romney's private attempt at candor turned into a public disaster when a hidden camera captured him dismissing nearly half the country as dependent, unproductive, and unreachable. That moment did not merely wound Romney politically. It crystallized a narrative Obama's team had been quietly building, that Mitt Romney lived in a different country and a different mindset, far different than the people he sought to lead. Obama, on the other hand, he recalibrated his message.
Over the next 4 months, you have a choice to make. Not just between 2 political parties, or even 2 people. It's a choice between 2 very different plans for our country.
The professor of 2008 now became the guardian of 2012, not promising miracles, but stability. not offering transcendence, but reassurance. His story was no longer about transformation. It was about endurance, about steering the ship through the storm, about protecting the fragile recovery, rather than returning the helm to those who had steered the nation into crisis. Romney won the debates, especially the first of 3 presidential debates where Obama looked completely perplexed, uninterested, and unprepared. At the end of the day, though, it didn't matter, as Obama won the nation's emotional truth. On election night, Obama secured 332 electoral votes.
President Barack Obama won a second term Tuesday after a race that was primarily fought in just a handful of battleground states.
A decisive mandate, not of enthusiasm, but of trust, and he accomplished what every first-term president yearns for, a second term. Well, as for Mitt Romney, he looked like a president on paper, but Obama felt like one. And in America, those feelings, well, they outweigh credentials every single time. So as we look at the Obama presidency, he did not merely occupy the presidency. He kind of curated it. He understood that in an era of spectacle, the presidency had become less a governing office and more than a national kind of myth-taking institution. His image, the sharp suits, the poetic cadence, it became an instrument of power in itself. Photographs of Obama were not captured, they were composed. His speeches did not simply communicate policy, they enveloped listeners in a moral universe. And Obama's image was really built on dualities. Intellectual, yet relatable. Global, yet deeply American. Hopeful, yet he was disciplined. Empathetic, yet he was measured and controlled. However, this image has a cost. It's called distance. And over time, Obama's refusal to reveal emotional volatility, the trait that his supporters admired, began to feel like a refusal to inhabit the raw, messy realities Americans lived every day. He became somewhat of a figure of dignity in a nation increasingly desperate for catharsis. Look, Barack Obama was one of the most gifted political orators of his generation. At the podium, he delivered speeches that were carefully structured, eloquent, and highly inspirational. His major addresses often elevated political debate, framing policy disagreements within broader themes of national identity, responsibility, and shared purpose. In formal settings, Obama's calm cadence and precise language conveyed authority and thoughtfulness, reinforcing the image of a leader guided by discipline and reason. But that rhetorical strength, however, did not always carry over into more informal political settings. Away from prepared speeches, Obama often appeared quite reserved and analytical rather than instinctively expressive. He was known for maintaining emotional control, listening carefully and responding in measured, reflective ways. In unscripted moments, such as casual crowd interactions or retail politics, this restraint could come across as seeming distant, even to supporters who admired him. I met him a few years ago, and the way he acted with me was spot on to what I just said. Calm, composed, slightly guarded, almost professorial in speaking with me. The complete opposite of a Bill Clinton.
As teachers, as policemen, as nurses, as family service workers.
Someone who never met a crowd he didn't like. At the same time, there were moments, particularly following national tragedies, when Obama's composure gave way to visible emotion. These instances revealed genuine depth of feeling, but they stood out precisely because they were rare. Overall, Obama's public persona reflected a leader whose emotional engagement was real, but tightly controlled. His political appeal rested less on personal intimacy and more on the power of ideas, disciplined leadership, and the belief that thoughtful rhetoric could move a nation forward. Washington is a city built on proximity, not ideological proximity, but physical and emotional closeness. It thrives on the gestures that rarely make headlines, yet quietly determine who gets what. The informal handshake after a tense meeting, the late-night bourbon shared in a dimly lit Capitol Hill office, the whispered negotiation that reframes an entire bill. Power in Washington is social before it is political. It moves between people who know how to cultivate relationships, soothe egos, flatter donors, and play a game much older than the institutions that house it. Barack Obama was never built for that world. He approached politics like a constitutional scholar conducting a seminar, elegant in argument, disciplined in thought, indifferent to the rituals that made Washington function. He favored analysis over backslapping, abstraction over anecdote, logic over flattery. To him, politics should have been about problem solving and structural reform, not choreographed displays of camaraderie. But Washington is not an academic institution. It is a fraternity of power. To the Beltway establishment, lobbyists, dealmakers, donors, think tank operatives, and congressional old lions, Obama, he was not one of them. He was management, not membership. He didn't linger in cloakrooms. He didn't indulge in late-night social drinking sessions. He did not cultivate long, nostalgic relationships across the aisle the way Lyndon Baines Johnson or even Joe Biden had once done. He possessed an almost monastic distance, a sense that the machinery of Washington was something he should rise above rather than wade into. And Congress saw him as aloof. The Pentagon saw him as cerebral. And career bureaucrats saw him as impatient with rituals they believed were essential to governance. And far from the marble columns of the Capitol, in the Rust Belt, the old industrial spine of America stretching from Pennsylvania to Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Iowa, Obama struggled to form the personal bonds that had once anchored Democratic politics. These were communities shaped by steel mills, auto plants, and union halls, places where politicians were expected to show up, not with perfect speeches, but with sleeves rolled up, voices lowered, and ears open. Obama's rhetorical brilliance won applause, but his detachment, his inability at times or unwillingness to inhabit the intimate social fabric of these regions left many voters feeling somewhat unseen. Look, they respected him, admired him. Many of them voted for him twice in 2008 and 2012, but they did not feel he was there for them in the end. Not by the end of his second term, that is. Inside his own administration, Obama governed like a CEO guarding the integrity of a well-crafted brand. Access was rationed, messaging was highly centralized, dissent was processed and filed rather than aired and debated. He built not a political coalition, but an operational hierarchy. So this created a presidency astonishingly free from scandal, a complete rarity in modern American politics. Yet it also created a presidency free from the emotional bonds that lubricate both governance and trust. Obama did not charm Washington into cooperation. He quietly actually resented that Washington expected to be charmed at all. And Washington, both the professional insiders and the working class communities far from it, somewhat resented him back for this. Not because he failed, not at all, but because he refused to play the game they believed power required. In that distance, intellectual, cultural, and geographic, the seeds of a future political revolt quietly took root. Let's be honest, every modern president thinks of his legacy, and that includes Barack Obama. He governed with a historian's gaze, seeing each decision not only for its immediate impact, but for its place in the moral arc of the American narrative. The Affordable Care Act, the killing of Osama bin Laden, the Iran nuclear deal, the Paris Climate Agreement, Cuba normalization. These were not isolated achievements. They were chapters of a legacy he was actively constructing. He believed history would vindicate his pragmatism, that the narrative of progress would outlast the noise of contemporary politics. He also curated his personal imagery with extraordinary discipline. The iconic photo of Obama alone in the Situation Room. The image of him leaning down to let a young black boy touch his hair. The moment he sang Amazing Grace at the church in Charleston, South Carolina. But legacy is never a one-way street. It is shaped by not only what a leader builds, but by what comes after. And what came after him would redefine everything he had imagined. By the end of Barack Obama's presidency, a deep and weary emotional fatigue had settled across the country, somewhat like a late winter fog. Dense, lingering, kind of difficult to shake. The economy had technically recovered. Charts and graphs insisted as much, but millions of Americans felt the recovery had bypassed them entirely. Inequality widened even as indicators improved. And then there were the wars that were supposed to wind down but never truly ended. Instead, they mutated, shifting into drone campaigns, proxy conflicts, and shadow battles that left the public uncertain whether America was withdrawing from the world or entangling itself more deeply within it. Healthcare expanded, covering millions who had long lived without insurance. Yet the confusion, technological failures, and higher costs that accompanied the transition left many voters feeling more anxious than reassured. And what about race, the wound that so many hoped Obama's election in 2008 might finally heal? It did not quiet. In fact, it erupted into the national consciousness with a volatility that shattered the myth of a post-racial America. Progressives grumbled that Obama had been too cautious, too analytical, too bound by the gravity of institutions he had promised to transform. And what about conservatives? Well, they complained that he had bent the nation away from its core identity, redefining America in a way they felt was alien, unrecognizable, threatening. And the middle class, working class white America in faded factory towns, hollowed out Rust Belt cities, rural communities with shuttered main streets, they felt forgotten, watching the promises of hope pass over them like a weather system that never brought rain. It was in this emotional landscape, anxious, polarized, and spiritually unmoored, that a new political force emerged, one built not on aspiration but on grievance, a force that understood the country's fatigue, its disappointment, its desire for something, anything that broke the cycle of polite political paralysis. Into this void stepped Donald Trump. He arrived not as a politician but as a televised shockwave.
In Hillary Clinton's America, the system stays rigged against Americans. Syrian refugees flood in. Illegal immigrants convicted of committing crimes get to stay.
A man who shattered decorum and seemed to speak from a place few public figures dared acknowledge. The raw, unfiltered ID of an electorate that no longer wanted careful explanations or professorial nuances. Where Obama offered eloquence, Trump offered instinct. Where Obama offered steadiness, Trump offered volatility. And where Obama embodied composure, Trump reveled in combat. To millions who felt unseen, unheard, and forgotten during the Obama years, Trump was not merely a candidate, he was payback. When Barack Obama finally stepped away from the White House in January 2017, he did not vanish from public consciousness. He remained etched into the nation's sight, a silhouette of elegance, restraint, intelligence, and composure, the kind of leader who seemed to belong not to messy, modern politics, but to some imagined era of moral clarity. Let's be honest, he left office with personal dignity intact, unmarred by scandal, his family admired, his electrifying speeches praised, and his image polished almost to a mythic sheen. But that very perfection cast a long, stark shadow across American politics. In defining what a modern president could be, he also defined what millions no longer wanted. Donald Trump did not simply fill the vacuum Obama left, he thrived in it. Every quality that had once insulated Obama from crisis now became the contrast that amplified Trump's rise. Obama's restraint made Trump's theatrics and raw insults
when we had that stiff Mitt Romney, a total stiff,
irresistible
who, by the
to
way,
those who felt
he's
silenced.
a dope. He's not as smart.
Obama's intellectualism made Trump's emotional immediacy feel refreshing. Obama's professional tone, patient, deliberate, reflective, made Trump's bluntness and rage feel, at least to millions, like long-term denied truth. To be clear, Obama had shown the world a presidency elevated by what he and his supporters deemed dignity. Trump and his supporters would now show the world a presidency fueled by grievance and disruption. Obama had rewritten the story of American power, but he could not control the sequel. The country he left behind was inspired, fractured, uplifted, disillusioned, and suspended between the dignity it admired and the disruption it ultimately chose with its next president. Up next, George W. Bush.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
From untested governor to global commander-in-chief, a presidency forged in crisis and controversy. Thanks for listening to Chasing Power, the path to Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm your host, Charles Denyer.
Before we wrap up, don't miss out on Charles's 2 other powerhouse podcasts. Want weekly intel on the national security threats most never see? Threat Level Red delivers hard-hitting updates on rogue nations, global conflicts, cyber warfare, and more, all revealed with unflinching clarity. And for leaders navigating today's digital world, The Brief with Charles Denyer is your trusted guide to cybersecurity, compliance, risk, and AI. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Chasing Power, The Path to Pennsylvania Avenue is a Charles Denyer Productions podcast. All opinions expressed are those of the host and do not reflect the official positions of any political organization, government agency, or private institution. This podcast is for news reporting, commentary, and criticism. We use excerpts, clips, and quotations from political events and other copyrighted works under the Fair Use Doctrine. All rights in those works remain with their respective owners. The views expressed are our own and do not represent any other entity.